Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois. In her first announcement as Chancellor, Rachel Reeves accuses the Conservatives of leaving a $28 billion black hole in Britain's public finances and laying the groundwork for tax rises later this year.
So I will today set out the necessary and urgent work that I have already done to reduce that pressure on the public finances.
But the Tories have hit back over the claims, with former Chancellor Jeremy Hunt calling them inconceivable. At a glance, Britain's financial landscape looks pretty bleak. National debt is the highest it's ever been, and the public have been feeling the pinch of the cost of living crisis, not to mention the highest tax burden this side of the Second World War. On top of that, Labour says the Conservatives spent a further $28 billion since the last budget in March of this year on unfunded and undeclared commitments. These include $14.8 billion of public sector pay rises above what was budgeted, $8.2 billion on asylum and immigration costs, $2.2 billion in extra military support for Ukraine, and $2 billion more in payments to private rail companies due to decreased passenger demand.
Some, including the Leader of the Opposition and the Shadow Chancellor, have claimed the books were open. How dare they? It is not true. And let me tell you why. There are very clear instances. This level of overspend is not sustainable. Left unchecked, it is a risk to economic stability. And unlike the party opposite, I will never take risks with our country's economic stability.
Now, let's take a look at the short-term cuts the Chancellor plans to make to fill the shortfall. She will get rid of winter fuel payments for around 10 million pensioners, scrap a cap on social care costs in England, cancel the building of transport infrastructure, including 2 major roads and a scheme to reopen train lines, cancel plans for a new school qualifications in England, stop non-essential government spending on consultants, scale back government communications and marketing spend, and sell unused public sector buildings and land. Labour seem to be trying to pin the blame for all this financial woe firmly on the Conservatives. But the former Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, says Labour must have been aware of the shortfall.
She says, Mr. Speaker, the information is new. But she herself told the Financial Times, you don't need to win an election to find out the state of public finances, as we've got the OBR now. Paul Johnson of the IFS says the state of public finances were apparent pre-election to anyone who cared to look, which is why he and other independent figures say her argument is not credible and won't wash.
Joining me now to discuss this are former advisor to the Bank of England, Roger Gale, and the Times chief political correspondent, Aubrey Allegretti. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Roger, let me start with you, if I may. We've heard from Rachel Reeves in that clip. We've heard from Jeremy Hunt. But in short, we got more money for junior doctors. We got more money for the public sector, twice the times of inflation. Is the cupboard as really bare as Rachel Reeves tells us it is with this black hole?
No, of course not. I mean, this is the same old political games and political football that we always hear. It's a load of nonsense. I find it disgusting. I really am dismayed that we get it from one government after another. I think they go to school to learn this, in PPE classes or something. Let's start, if I may, with Bates Motel Hunt a few Novembers ago, if you remember, when he told us that we had a £55 billion black hole. Oh my God, and we've got to fill this immediately. So he said, I'm going to fill it with 25 billion pounds of stealth taxes, which he did the next day. And then 30 billion, I'm going to cut services, defense, NHS, police, education, all sorts of things. he enacted the 25 billion of stealth taxes and then kicked 48 hours later the 30 billion into the long grass, never to be heard of again. It didn't exist. It was complete nonsense. The number of think tanks that came out within 5 minutes and said, you know, if Fishy Rishi and Bates Motel Hunt had calculated...
You've got to explain. Bates Motel, what are we talking about here?
Psycho. He scares me every time I see him.
Well, he's not Chancellor anymore, so let's bring this back to Rachel Reeves a little bit.
He's a shadow Chancellor.
Okay, let's bring him back. Let's bring him back.
But what I'm saying is that they invented, Rishi and he, this 55 billion black hole, said think tanks that if they had calculated the national debt the way they had been doing whilst Rishi was Chancellor, we actually would have had a 15 billion pound surplus at the time. So they make this up in order to enact tax rises.
So, Aubrey, the politics of this, Roger's basically saying this was not an economic statement. It was not an audit of government finances. It was all about politics. The politics, of course, to blame forthcoming tax rises on the last Conservative government. Is it going to work?
So to some extent, this is about presentation. And obviously, a black hole is only a black hole because it's created by the fiscal rules that Labour are in charge of setting and have promised to adhere to, that they've adopted from the previous Conservative government. So they have more sort of free rein than perhaps they're letting on. But when it comes to how they are using this to lay the ground for the budget in October, they are trying to sort of punch the bruise, cause the Conservatives maximum political pain and blame them for the inheritance that they've received, not just in the sort of wider economic context, but also in things like prisons, in transport, in infrastructure, in the new hospitals building programme that Boris Johnson heralded back in 2019 with the promise of 40 new hospitals. And so Labour spent all of the election campaign ruling out tax rises for national insurance, income tax, and the headline rate of VAT, but they were conspicuously quiet on the notion of capital gains, changing inheritance tax, and potentially a pensions relief raid as well. So all of these issues, I suspect, are being used to try and convince the public that things are much worse than they thought, and there wasn't any way for Labour to have known this in the run-up to the election. They'll argue this was all being hidden from them, and therefore that's why they need to then potentially move forward with those tax rises they haven't rolled out.
And that's interesting. That's the politics behind it, laying the ground for more tax rises. Before we talk about the impact of that, though, Roger, one thing Rachel Reeves was very keen to do was position herself, first time as Chancellor, as this, with fiscal rectitude, that she was sound money. We can't spend what we don't have. First of all, is that a good thing to do? And secondly, did she achieve that, do you think?
No and no. Aubrey's absolutely right. I mean, we were both saying the same thing. It's political maneuvering. And they always do it, to justify tax rises and make themselves look good and the others not look good. I mean, being a shadow chancellor means that you are fully in possession of the figures from every possible source long before the election. So to say, oh my goodness, we discovered a black hole this morning, is risible.
Yeah, but isn't it more risible? You're quite right that although she'll deny it, she had access to all these figures. Isn't it more risible to actually say, I've got a black hole of 22 billion, but 10 billion of that is because I've just waved through 5.5% pay rise for 6 million public sector workers.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think she announced the 22 before she announced the pay rise. So those are on top of it.
Well, you've got the junior doctors, which is on top of this.
On top of that, yeah.
But 10 billion of this is directly attributed to her public sector pay rise.
Yeah.
It's nothing to do with the Conservatives, is it?
Well, no, exactly. But then, I'm actually very glad that she did those pay rises. I think it's about...
You don't think they're inflationary?
Look, I mean, of course they're inflationary, and there's nothing wrong with a little bit of inflation now that we're at 2%, as long as Andrew Bailey and the others at the Bank of England don't continue to mistakenly think they're fighting consumer-driven inflation and raise interest rates.
But won't it be consumer-driven inflation if actually you start putting pay rises into the pockets, more classic as we know it, consumer-driven inflation?
No. Consumer-driven inflation, demand pull inflation, as it's called, is when people are overspending, when you need to buy yourself another 60-pound silk tie, when you go on an extra holiday, that sort of thing. Here, people are just trying to catch up with the cost of living crisis. That money that's going in pay rises to these public sector workers and junior doctors is helping them meet the cost of living. It's not fueling inflation.
Well, Aubrey, one thing that won't help the cost of living is this extraordinary decision to withdraw, made by Rachel Reeves, to withdraw winter fuel allowances from a large number of pensioners, those who basically do not get additional benefits, is probably the simplest way of explaining it. What's the politics of that? Because only weeks before the election, Keir Starmer was proudly boasting that pensioners had nothing to fear from him.
It will be really difficult for the government, and probably the most sort of risky move of all of those announced this week. It's thought to affect around 10 million pensioners, those who aren't already in receipt of pension credits or other sorts of benefits. And so the calculation must have been made that there was a saving to be made here. And the message I'm being told that's being given to Labour MPs is that because of the triple lock, people will still be better off next year because they'll see their pension rise by around 5.5% in line with earnings than they were last year, even though they're now having to sort of pay for some of their winter fuel instead of using this allowance. And so I suspect there are Labour MPs who are really uncomfortable about it. I spoke to some, including ministers, who think, you know, constituents will be hit very hard by this. They're very shocked and upset. But this is Labour's honeymoon period. This is probably the point where they can get away with making those more unpopular decisions. I suppose Rachel Reeves will be hoping that she has given people enough notice that there might be more to come. She's talked about other difficult decisions which don't just mean tax rises, but they could also mean spending cuts as well in the budget on October the 30th.
We can talk about the potential tax rises later, but on this winter fuel allowance, Roger, isn't the truth that not all pensioners need a winter fuel allowance, and that there will be some agreement that this was a step in the right direction, not to just have a universal benefit paid out to silver surfers and pensioners who frankly got a very good cost of living situation at the moment, very good incomes. It's not a bad move, is it?
Yes, well, as I've been saying for some time, I'm far more frightened of Labour than I was of the Tories, as bad, as incompetent as they were. But credit where it's due. I mean, I do applaud the junior doctors and the public service workers, and yeah, I'm in favor of the winter pension cut for people who don't need it. You know, I don't need to go out and have a good meal with that check if it can go to somebody who needs it more. I don't think that that's particularly a bad thing.
But let me press you a little bit on what you've just said about applauding the 22% pay rise for junior doctors.
Over 2 years.
Over 2 years, but they've already said they're going to be coming back for more. But also, you've got this general 5.5% increase that's twice the rate, over twice the rate of inflation for all public sector workers. This is just open season now, isn't it? Who next is going to be coming back, having looked at the junior doctors who are saying, we need pay restoration, we've lost out since 2008, hence 22%. The nurses will be next. What about the teachers? I mean, surely your generous approach to these pay rises is going to be a key problem for the government.
I don't think the floodgates need to open. I think that the sectors where it's been addressed were crucial ones. The healthcare system would have fallen apart if something weren't done. And, you know, this is something that...
But no increases in productivity in the healthcare system for about the last 10, 15 years, and yet dishing out more money
No
to them?
increases in Britain in productivity since 1990. We would have...
Well, yeah, but focus on the health service. Can't let you get away with that. Come on. There's been no increases in productivity with all the money that has been splashed onto the NHS. And now they're giving them more pay. It doesn't sound fair. And not fair, by the way, sure, and let me take this point up with you. The political contrast between dishing out money to doctors and back pay for 2008 for them and the 5.5% public sector pay rise, but we're going to take it off pensioners.
I think Labour made a calculation about wanting to save themselves kind of money and questions about a crisis of productivity by stopping operations and hospital appointments going ahead if they didn't give this money and strikes continued.
Yeah.
People were just feeling like the country was kind of grinding to a halt. That was the message that was just ringing in everyone's ears in the run-up to the election. And so I sort of think Labour had no choice but to settle. Obviously, it is a political choice what you award these people, but the system has always been that there are independent pay review bodies that made this recommendation. They made the recommendation under the last government. That's why Labour can claim this was something they inherited rather than a Conservative decision. And obviously, there is a risk that it does open the floodgates for other sectors as well. I think GPs have announced they might go on strike as well. So as soon as you have one sort of part of the NHS looking at another, which has got a very considerable pay rise, they'll potentially want more for their members as well.
Let's move on a little bit. Much of what Rachel Reeves said was all about the awful economic landscape she's inherited, Roger. Let me just remind you what Jeremy Hunt pointed out. He said this is nonsense what she's saying, that inflation today at 2%, nearly half of what it was in 2010 when Labour, the Conservatives took over from Labour. Unemployment is nearly half what it was then, back in 2010. More new jobs created than nearly anywhere else in Europe. And so far this year, he went on to say, we are the fastest growing G7 economy. And over the next 6 years, the IMF says the UK will grow faster than France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. It's not an awful economy they've inherited, is it?
Well, I mean, it's only a couple of weeks ago that it was announced we were the least productive G7 country, so I don't know what he's talking about.
Well, I mean, those figures are pretty good as a comparison, aren't they?
But if they're correct, yes. But I mean, as I say, a couple of weeks ago,
do you think the IMF are wrong to say that that they're the fastest growing economy in the G7 so far?
It depends whose figures you're looking at. They're all a moving feast. As I say, a couple of weeks ago, we were at the bottom of the G7 table beneath Portugal. And inflation, the Tories did nothing to reduce inflation, nor did the Bank of England. In fact, the 14 rate rises, as I've been saying for 2 years now, because this is not consumer-driven inflation.
No, you're right. You've said that, and we've had that on this show before.
Yeah.
But I'm not talking about the credit they can claim or otherwise. What he's saying is you haven't inherited a rubbish landscape. You've got low inflation. And I'm pressing you on this. It's not as bad a landscape as Labour would have us believe, is it?
Yes, there are two main issues I think that are extremely important that both governments have ignored, and I think it's a tragedy. The first is that they should have moved the lower income tax threshold if they really wanted to help people. It costs about £40 billion a year to move from £12,570 to 20 grand. And that 40 billion pounds could easily be covered by us giving up the subterfuge, the smoke and mirrors, the Jeremy Hunt and his predecessor's scheme, the Andrew Bailey scheme of paying money to the banks on printed quantitative easing money. The banks have only had 14 interest rate rises. They desperately need more money, don't they? But we're paying them interest of 40 billion a year on money that we print. Switzerland doesn't do that. The European Central Bank doesn't do that. Most countries don't do that. Eliminate that 40 billion, which is going from the left hand to the right hand, and stop using it as a subterfuge for how broke we are, and increase the income tax threshold and help the lower paid and the pensioners.
That's a hypothesis that I'm sure many would agree with. But let me ask you, Aubrey, first on this point. We were told that Labour will be the party of growth. They want rapid, in fact, they need rapid growth to deliver on some of their more bolder promises. She's cut hospitals, building programs. She's cut infrastructure on railways. She's cut infrastructure on roads. Doesn't that kind of contradict their ambition? They want to be a party that will stimulate growth.
Certainly, I think there is a real tension in government between those who think that these measures might reduce the capacity for the country to grow. You know, when we're talking about major infrastructure projects, kind of rail lines being cut, which would improve connectivity and potentially productivity, even to sort of fairly limited degrees. These are the sorts of investments that you need to make now that will pay off years in the future. Keir Starmer, during the election campaign, talked about being so against sticking plaster politics. And it feels as though there are some in Labour who are worried they've gone too far in sort of cutting off their nose to spite their face by having to make some of these savings in the immediate term, but at what cost in the long term, so that Labour can't claim to be the champions of growth and potentially, as you said, inhibit their ability to raise money by increasing revenues because there just isn't more money going into the economy.
And it was Rachel Reeves, Roger, of course, who said, you can't tax your way to growth. Yet most commentators, and I don't know if you feel the same, think almost certainly she is going to be coming after more tax in the next budget scheduled for October the 31st. What taxes do you think she'll be after? Assuming she doesn't give you your increase in thresholds to 20,000. Let's say that's not going to happen.
There's two things, if I may, very quickly. I said the first, which is increase the threshold, and the other is to decouple.
You don't think she's going to do the increase of the threshold, do you?
No.
I'm asking you what you think she's going to come after.
But if I could just say, the other thing is to decouple electricity from the price of gas. We're paying far too much for our energy needlessly because gas does not produce most of our electricity. And governments have been told this over and over. They could cut the costs of energy tomorrow by a huge amount, but for some reason they don't do it. What taxes will she increase? I think Aubrey has said, I think capital gains, I think motoring tax. I think there'll be
Do you mean fuel tax?
Fuel tax, and there's a rumor.
Well, fuel tax is another inflationary pressure, isn't it?
Well, fuel tax is a triple tax because you pay the fuel duty on the petrol or the diesel. You then pay VAT on the petrol, diesel, and on the fuel duty.
And that feeds through to our lorries, transporting
and the
our
money
goods.
to pay for that comes out of your pocket that's already suffered PAYE. So it's a triple tax. I think that they'll tax all sorts of things, but I was going to say there is a rumor going around that we'll be charged something. They really don't want cars. And there's a rumor going around that we're going to be charged 8p a mile to drive. Now, I don't know whether that will happen.
Do you think
or not.
that's likely to happen? I mean, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, he has toyed with that himself as well. He's been talking about it. Do you think that's a realistic possibility? Where do you think the axe will fall?
Inflating the prospect of it being introduced.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, cities have looked at introducing low and ultra-low emission zones and expanding them, but I think the Labour government would be very wary of doing anything which was seen as being a sort of war on motorists.
Yeah.
There was obviously the infamous Uxbridge by-election last year, which Labour lost by about 800 votes, and from that was extrapolated this huge kind of national meaning that voters were really sort of anti the government's net zero
profoundly
agenda.
wrong.
Well, exactly, yeah. So we shouldn't read too much into these things, but I think the government as a whole, you know, it's really important for them to keep on side people like White Van Man, somebody who the Sun newspaper has always really championed. I think they'll be wary of doing anything which hammers those, although fuel duty, of course, has been frozen forever. I think the OBR just says it's ridiculous.
Actually, I've only got 2 minutes left, so I want to focus you a little bit on this. So recently, for the first time after how many months? Something like 2 years, isn't it? You'll know, Roger. We had an interest rate cut from the Bank of England of 0.25%. Was that necessary? And is it right to have done it when many consider more inflationary pressures on the way?
Yes, absolutely, because as I say, raising interest rates does not combat this kind of inflation. In fact, it prolongs it and inflates the inflation. That's why it's taken so long for it to come down.
Aubrey, do you think this is, there was a little bit of the Bank of England might have wanted to do this in the month up to the election, but delayed it and now have whacked it in?
It did seem, recalling previous meetings of the MPC, that there was a growing view that this should be cut in the last few months. But I suspect, they were wary about intruding too much on the general election. And I mean, again, it raises more questions for why Rishi Sunak decided to call it when he did.
Yeah.
Labour, within their first month of government, are able to, if they wanted to, claim credit for, or at least ride off the coattails of the benefits of people having slightly more money in their pockets or not facing quite as high borrowing costs anymore. So I think, Rachel Reeves will be feeling very happy. Not
a bad start, not a bad end to her week, given the trauma she caused in her politics when taking away things like pensioners' wealth fuel tax. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. We'll have you back again, I think, after the budget, because I think we should be then looking at the first substantive financial statement of the new Labour government, and we'll see how they fare then. Thanks to Aubrey Allegretti of The Times and, of course, Roger Givault, former Bank of England advisor. Perhaps they should be listening a bit more to you these days, Roger. Thanks again to all my guests for joining me. And don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.